From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in the nation's capital, where the Speaker of the House just got the most important endorsement in politics. Yes, from Donald Trump. We'll discuss with former Republican Congressman Denver Riggleman and with our political panel. But of course, Washington is now gearing up for more than the new Congress and the inauguration, with preparations now also underway for a presidential funeral. After Jimmy Carter died yesterday at 100, we're going to spend some time here in the outset of our conversation seeking perspective here on Jimmy Carter's life and presidency. First, with my friend and colleague David Westin, who joins us from world headquarters in New York, of course, the host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. And David, it's great to see you. I hope your holidays are well. And we're lucky to have you today in the office. A lot of people have been talking about the presidency of Jimmy Carter. I heard you weighing in a little bit earlier with some highlights and lowlights and a lot of comparisons to the Biden White House. But I want to hear from you first on the man who grew up in a house in Plains, Georgia, without electricity or plumbing, to become a nuclear physicist, a graduate of the Naval Academy, the governor, and then the president. It's a pretty remarkable story.
Yeah, it is an amazing story, actually, as you say, from very humble backgrounds in a peanut farm, and then did go to the Naval Academy and became a nuclear sub commander under Rickover. Extraordinary. Then went back to the peanut farm when his father died, and then became, of course, the governor of Georgia and ultimately the president of the United States. Perhaps one of the least likely candidates for president, perhaps until, of course, we had Donald Trump. But like Donald Trump, very much an outsider in Washington who got elected in part because of the circumstances that really prevailed at the time, because he was coming out of Watergate, as we know, with the debacle of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford's pardon, and also the terrible situation with the war in Vietnam, which had ended just a few years earlier, where the United States really had a terrible struggle.
Changed the way we look at the presidency, though, right? He carried his own bags, David. He was the first president to get out of the motorcade to walk the inauguration route.
Yeah, and he did it very much on purpose when he got out with Rosalynn Carter, his wife, to walk the route. He wanted to show that he was not part of an imperial presidency, as it was perceived Richard Nixon really was, that this is a really presidency of the people. And he wanted to reach out to people. And he was, in many ways, a personally, I think, modest man, very self-confident, maybe even arrogant, very smart. But modest in his personal habits, and he communicated that right straight through his life. He never really varied from that.
As an outsider, I heard you referencing this earlier on Bloomberg today. You could argue that he paved the road for some unlikely politicians who would follow him, including Donald Trump.
No, absolutely right, because as I say, if you went a few years before he was elected president, almost no one would have thought he would have made it. And I think you could say something similar to Donald Trump the first time around when he ran for presidency, and really did run in some ways against Washington the way Donald Trump did. He didn't call it a swamp, but there was sort of that underlying thing. He also had a lot of problems with his own party, as you know, Joe. He was a moderate. He was sort of to the center, even a little bit conservative side of the Democratic Party, and he ran crosswise of a lot of his own party. Interesting in perspective, because he was actually trying to rein in government in many respects and be a little bit more fiscally responsible, and his party really, particularly up on Capitol Hill, wanted him to spend more money and go further, and particularly pursue fossil fuels. He got in a lot of trouble with Senator Byrd over that subject. So he ran against his party to some extent, and perhaps paid a price for it.
Will history be kinder to him than, say, journalists were writing the first draft in Jimmy Carter's life?
You know, I'm always reluctant to talk about what history's going to say, but I think the way you phrased that, I think I can pretty confidently say definitely history already is kinder to him than what people were saying when he left the presidency. We have to remember he was only there 4 years, and there was so much that went on domestically and internationally during that time. Much of it a struggle, the Iranian hostage crisis, Russia going into Afghanistan, the oil crisis, domestically stagflation went on. At the same time, he did broker the Camp David Accords, got at and it really brought peace of a sort to the Middle East between between at least Egypt and Israel. He also normalized relations with China and gave the Panama Canal back to Panama, although the incoming new president, Donald Trump, apparently is thinking about giving it back to them, getting it back.
He sure is. David, it's great to see you. David Westin, of course, the host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week, with us from World Headquarters in New York. We appreciate the context and the perspective here. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We did hear from Joe Biden. He's in St. Croix, of course, for the holidays, addressed the nation upon the news of Jimmy Carter's death. Let's listen.
America and the world, in my view, lost a remarkable leader. What I find extraordinary about Jimmy Carter, though, is that millions of people all around the world, all over the world, feel they lost a friend as well, even though they never met him. And that's because Jimmy Carter lived a life measured not by words, but by his deeds.
I want to add the voice of Andra Gillespie, Associate Professor of Political Science at Emory University, a frequent voice on this program. Professor, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. There are so many comparisons. We've been hearing them since before Jimmy Carter went into hospice to the Biden administration. Donald Trump himself, who today had some nicer things to say about Jimmy Carter, constantly making that comparison. Was it fair?
I think in some ways people are going to sort of use them as parallels because of their relatively short terms. But Jimmy Carter and Joe Biden have different things. When Joe Biden became president of the United States, he came with decades of Washington experience. And I think as we look to see what the legislative impact of his policy agenda was, it's going to look different, though it's going to be substantial, as was President Carter's. President Carter came in as an outsider. He's coming in off of the heels of Watergate. He came in to set a new tone to try to help to restore trust in American institutions that have been ravaged by the mistakes that President Nixon had made. And I think, the thing that's really going to distinguish President Carter from President Biden is his post-presidency. So, looking at the actuarial tables, Joe Biden isn't going to have the type of post-presidency that Jimmy Carter had. But Jimmy Carter was able to build upon the record that I think was unheralded while he served in office. But he was able to build on that record to have, the gold standard for post-presidencies. And part of that was because he was voted out of office. He was in his mid-50s and he had a long life. And so he had a long time to be able to cultivate a legacy around the world of helping to promote democracy, eradicate disease, promote peace.
The longest-lived former president in American history. He certainly used the time. To your point, Professor, how has that changed the way we look at his actual presidency? Because everything you hear today, including the statement from Donald Trump, well, I didn't agree with this, or I didn't think he made the right decision here as president, but he went on to convince me that he was a great patriot and that he was to be trusted.
Yeah, I think that was very gracious of incoming President Trump. But it's also just the consistency and the integrity with which he lived his life. I think that that's probably going to be his greatest legacy. I think people forget that in 1976, people were still reeling from Watergate. There were concerns, about corruption. Jimmy Carter presenting himself as a Baptist school teacher and a born-again Christian. And even though it was maligned at the time, the type of person who really did try to live out his faith was something that was supposed to be a refreshing reversal, of course, for the United States. When he was in office, he was often accused of hectoring. So when we talk about the energy crisis, his admonitions to Americans to turn down the thermostat and put on a sweater were not necessarily particularly well received. But, when we think, about what he was saying this all in good faith. And, even though he was voted out of office in 1980, when he's continuing to live that life and to live it consistently and to try to live out his faith as best as he could, I think people saw the genuineness. And, and that also manifested itself in terms of the causes that they took up. So looking for diseases that people weren't thinking about that affected people in the developing world, going after the most vulnerable, helping to amplify the efforts of Habitat for Humanity. This is a person who kind of, really tried to walk the talk and to live out his faith in a really exceptional way. And I think that that's part of the reason why so many people had so much respect for him.
The Camp David Accords, I think, would be considered a pretty remarkable success for any presidency, even if that was the only thing he had to show for it. But of course, he had the Iranian hostage crisis that so many people remember just as strongly, in fact, more in some cases here. He said in 2015, I was really taken by this, Professor, one of the big regrets he had in his life when asked if he had any. He said, quote, "I wished I'd sent one more helicopter to get the hostages. We would have rescued them, and I would have been reelected." Is that true?
So I would leave that up to my diplomatic historians to say that, but I think you always think of what you could do to help ease suffering for people, and that certainly was a hallmark of President Carter's life. The truth is that there is sort of the symbol of the hostages coming home as Ronald Reagan is being inaugurated into office, and
yes,
so there
right.
certainly is a certain political centering and symbolism there that one wished you could have avoided, and certainly the inability to be able to get the hostages home sort of contributed to this perception in some instances, and I think, in hindsight was undeserved, that President Carter was feckless. And so that contributing to, the stagnating economy at the time and the energy crisis certainly, made people feel a certain type of malaise that I think we're familiar with today. And I think the lesson of Carter, and perhaps 20 years from now, the lesson of Joe Biden is we shouldn't necessarily make decisions about presidents based on how we feel in the moment or based on short-term calculations.
Well, boy, that's a professor talking if there ever was one. You're talking to a journalist here. Be careful. Andra Gillespie. Can we remind our listeners and viewers, by the way, that he never used the word malaise in the so-called malaise speech? How did that happen?
So I defer to the historians about that, but it's not certainly the first time that a word kind of captures the zeitgeist, even if it wasn't directly said by,
It gets back to this first draft of history, though, doesn't it? You don't always believe the analysis, or don't always fully invest yourself in the analysis that you're hearing in real time, I think is the point that you're making, and I'll try to underscore here. In our remaining 2 moments, Professor, talk to me about the relationship that Jimmy Carter had with Atlanta, the fact that he went back the way that he did, and then, of course, staged a post-presidency that reinvented them all in his hometown.
Well, this is something that I've certainly benefited from. So he, lived in Plains, but he set up his presidential library at the Carter Center, which has a connection to Emory University, where I work. President Carter was on the faculty, so every year, as long as he was physically able to do so, he gave a convocation to all of our freshman students. It was certainly a treat to be able to attend one of those events. All of the freshmen had to attend. President Carter made himself available to faculty. He would invite you to lunch. He would also inform you if he was going to teach your class. And so I remember getting that email one year telling me President Carter is coming to your class on such and such a day. And, my one regret from that, I learned from a colleague who had that happen to her a couple of years later, is that I didn't video record that lecture. But the things that he said in that lecture in my class, I still repeat to my students, even more than a decade later.
That's really wonderful. I'm glad you could share that memory with us. Andra Gillespie, thank you so much. Professor, it's good to see you from Emory University, of course, in Atlanta, where the talk is, of course, about Jimmy Carter today. 100 years old, and we'll be talking a lot more about the life and legacy of the former president throughout the broadcast here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we do have a bit of news today. We're less than a week out from leadership elections, the start of the new Congress. And the Speaker of the House just landed the big endorsement. Donald Trump says he's on board, and so we may have a path forward here. We'll talk about it next with our political panel. Jeanne Zaino is with us, along with Maura Gillespie. The view from both sides of the aisle here on the fastest show in politics. Stay with us. A lot more ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Stay with us on Bloomberg.
The bond of our common humanity is stronger than the divisiveness of our fears and prejudices. God gives us a capacity for choice. We can choose to alleviate suffering. We can choose to work together for peace. We can make these changes, and we must.
2002, former President Jimmy Carter accepting the Nobel Peace Prize. The 39th President of the United States winning the prize for his decades of work seeking peaceful solutions to international conflicts, advancing democracy and human rights, and promoting economic and social development. Just part of a life story that we're reflecting on today, with Jimmy Carter dead at 100. And a remarkable remembrance not only underway right now, but the pomp and circumstance, the formal procession that will follow here in Washington, D.C., with a day of mourning now declared for January 9th. The stock market will be closed that day, and we're going to see the full deal here in the nation's capital, which is something we're pretty good at. If you recall the funeral parade, the procession for Ronald Reagan in 2004, we will likely have the caisson, the riderless horse, and the rest of the tradition that follows a moment like this. We have a lot to talk about with our panel together today on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Jeanne Zaino is with us, Democratic analyst, Bloomberg politics contributor, and political science professor at Iona University, joined by Maura Gillespie, founder, principal, Bluestack Strategies, Republican strategist, and a veteran of John Boehner's Speaker's office. It's great to see you both here. Maura, I'll start with you. Having spent time in the Speaker's office, just about the actual procession and the planning that's underway right now. The timing is peculiar. We have to start a new Congress. The stage is literally set with scaffolding for an inauguration on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue. What kind of a job is in store for leaders here to pull this off?
It's a lot of work for the people who work in the Capitol, for those who are working for the architect of the Capitol's office, for those who are on the Speaker's special events team, as well as their Senate counterparts. So it's a lot that needs to get done, because they are responsible for planning these events and for getting things out to members and to organization, for the invitations, for the run of show. There's a lot that needs to go into it, and so I'm sure they're working overtime to try and get this and honor the former president in this way that needs to be done, that has historically been done. So it's definitely all hands on deck with the political side of things, the more bickering kind of things, probably on the back burner, but certainly something that members need to remember is that the Speaker's office and the Speaker's role is as Speaker of the whole House. It is a institutional post as much as it is a policy post, and so it's really important that their team has the confidence to go into this knowing that they're keeping their gavel to continue doing the work that they need to get done for this former president, but also for the American people.
I've been trying to make the point, Jeanne, that, while we talk about a lot of tough stuff here on a daily basis, we usually talk about only the bad stuff that happens in Washington and how we can get nothing done. This is one of the things that Washington does very well. And I wonder what's going through your mind right now in the way that you hope people remember Jimmy Carter as we walk our way up to that procession.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because I think more than most modern presidents, Jimmy Carter is going to be remembered not just by Americans on the 9th and in the weeks prior, but by people around the world. He is somebody who is beloved in so many parts of the world because of the work he did both during his presidency, but importantly, post-presidency. So I think this is going to be a time of remembrance for people around the world. And I think there is going to be mourning for the loss of somebody like Jimmy Carter, who many people now reflect on and say it's hard to imagine somebody of his ilk being elected, not just president of the United States today, but a leader in the world today. And so it is a mourning not just of the person, but also of a moment in time that many people don't see us reliving, or a man, or person coming to prominence in the way Jimmy Carter did. It was quite unlikely presidency, and he certainly made the most of it.
You consider the obsession, Maura, that Donald Trump has with the projection of power. Every move is choreographed with that in mind, to show strength. The way he speaks, the way he positions his body, the whole bit, the optics surrounding that administration. Jimmy Carter was the opposite, as we've been noting. He carried his own bags. He was the first guy to get out of the limousine to walk the route. He goes on national television wearing a cardigan, telling people to turn down the thermostat. Obviously, we have a contrast here. Have we learned that one works and another does not?
don't think that it's a matter of one is better than the other, one works better than the other. I think that there are times in our history where we need a firmer hand, where we need to, present strength on the world stage when there are such bad actors that will fill that vacuum if we don't. So I think that there is something to be said about when you present strength in a way that maybe people like Donald Trump want to present strength in ways of, bravado and things like that. But, what I will say, and to Jeannie's point as well, it does feel as though a bygone era of when decency and humble servitude and servant leadership was really something that we valued as a nation and saw as admirable. And I do think that, if anything, I hope that these next few weeks in reflecting on Jimmy Carter's legacy, that's what we take away from it. Not necessarily getting into the, good, bad, or other policy decisions, but about the decency and the integrity he had as far as just, his humble beginnings.
Yeah, sure. Well, you wonder if that approach, with the approach that I described, at least, Jeannie, when it came to Jimmy Carter, if it would have been palatable in any other time. You could argue that Jimmy Carter wouldn't have been elected without Watergate, without Richard Nixon. You could also argue on the other end that Ronald Reagan would not have resonated with the American people in the way he was projecting power if it had not been for Jimmy Carter. I guess that's the definition of a transitional presidency. Is that the way we should look at it?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been a school of thought in academia for a long time amongst historians that without Ford's pardon of Nixon, there would have been no Carter. And to your point, there would have been no Reagan. And I think there's some truth to that. I'm reflecting on the humble nature of who he was. And you and Maura were just talking about that. And as we look towards Donald Trump's inauguration, one of the great stories he used to tell was that at his inauguration, his mother was asked by reporters, "Aren't you proud of your son?" And she said, "Which one?" And Jimmy Carter often reflected on that as sort of the roots, along with his religious, how religious he was, how devout he was. As, this was where he came from. His mother, Georgia, on a peanut farm. They grew up without running water, electricity. So he was humble through and through. And I think, unfortunately, what people have taken away in the short term as they've run for office is that did not serve him well in the immediate, in the presidency. Long term it may, but short term it didn't. And I think that's quite a loss. That, and of course, his promise to always be honest to the American people, even when it wasn't to his advantage. And he did that. And of course, poll-wise, it wasn't to his advantage.
Maura, are the comparisons to the Biden administration fair today?
I don't know that I would compare Jimmy Carter to Joe Biden. But again, to Judy's point, history has a way of showing us that we appreciate presidents long after they're gone. We appreciate the integrity that leaders show. I'm thinking of George W. Bush. I'm thinking of my former boss, John Boehner. People appreciate them more after they've left, reflecting on what they've done and what they did and sacrificing, again, similar to what, Jimmy Carter did by being honest, even if it wasn't always advantageous in the moment, in the long run, they served us well. And so I think that we, as we reflect on that, I wouldn't necessarily compare Joe Biden to Jimmy Carter, as I said, but I do think that there are some takeaways of that former style of leadership. And again, with being institutionalist and recognizing the value of protecting the integrity of our institutions and the system of government we have here. And I think that's what leadership is. And it may be a bygone era, but I hope that we can steer the course things back towards integrity and respect.
Oh, it's a great conversation with Maura Gillespie and Jeanne Zaino, and our panel will stay with us. They're back in hour 2 of Balance of Power because we still have to talk about what's happening in the House of Representatives with the big endorsement today from Donald Trump. Coming in line behind the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. We will talk about that ahead with former Republican Congressman Denver Riggleman. He's with us right here at the table in Washington, D.C., coming up next on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Stay with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for being with us on the fastest show in politics. It's Balance of Power, the Monday edition. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We do have news in the House of Representatives. Good news for the Speaker with the total endorsement, complete and total, I think how he put it, coming in from Donald Trump. We're going to talk about that in a moment with former Congressman Denver Riggleman, along with a number of other issues here in the nation's capital today. But we've also got our eyes on Wall Street, where it's a down day again. And Bloomberg's Alex Semenova is with us from World Headquarters in New York with the latest on this. How are we doing, Alex?
Hey, Joe, I'm well. Good to be on with you as always. No Santa Claus rally for investors in a period that tends to be bullish for equity prices. Stocks down for a third straight session, though some on Wall Street arguing that Santa simply came early this year. The S&P 500 still up 23% in 2024. And just taking a look at some of the moves today, if you look at the S&P 500 down 0.7%, and all but one of 11 sectors in the red today. Just energy up for the day. The technology-heavy NASDAQ 100 down 0.9% with the so-called Magnificent Seven stocks, the high flyers and winners of this year leading losses. In the Dow Jones Industrial Average down about 320 points. Bond yields have retreated just a bit. The U.S. 10-year yield down to 4.55% after handily eclipsing 4.6% last week. And Bitcoin, which is kind of a proxy for risk sentiment, down nearly 2% below the 92,000 level. Of course, Joe, you remember it surged to about 108,000 just earlier this month.
Yeah, boy, it's interesting to watch this come together at the end of the year here. Should we just assume that the Santa Claus rally was front-loaded? People got concerned about being overextended ahead of the new Congress and the new presidency?
It certainly seems to be the case. It can't stress enough how unusual it is to get 2 consecutive years of gains of more than 20% for the S&P 500 index. So a lot of investors are going into next year with a little bit more caution, uncertainty. If you go back to the history of bull markets, they tend to last on average about 6 years, and the third year tends to be the weakest one, usually seeing a single-digit return. So there's this element of wariness going into January, especially with uncertainty around what kind of policies Donald Trump will put into effect. A lot of people worried that they might be reflationary, tariffs, tax cuts at a time when yields are already rising. So that is certainly taking some of the luster off of these mega cap tech names that have seen just enormous gains for the past 2 years, obviously already with very lofty valuations, Joe.
All right, Alexandria, it's great to have you back. Alexandria Semenova in New York. We'll have more with Alex next hour as we follow the beat here on Wall Street. Not ending the year with a big smash, obviously, but we'll keep tabs on things for you straight through tomorrow, the last trading day of the year on Wall Street. The big news in the world of politics: complete and total endorsement for Speaker Mike Johnson. That, according to Donald Trump, taking to Truth Social and changing the course of the day here. We started the day by wondering if Mike Johnson had the votes to keep the gavel on Friday when the new Congress begins. It appears we may have an answer to that question now. And with us at the table, none other than Denver Riggleman, the former Republican congressman from Virginia, with us in person. Always a treat to see you. Hope your holidays are well.
Oh, great.
You're a happy guy because you're not doing this anymore, right?
It's absolutely ebullient. Is that a word? E-B-U? Yeah, but no, ebullient. Yes. Yeah, I'm ebullient. Yes.
Well, I like that. It's a nice place to start. I suspect that Mike Johnson is kind of feeling that way as well. Jim Comer, just this morning, was calling around the 20 people who helped to dispatch Kevin McCarthy to say, hey, you got to get on board with Mike Johnson. I guess the job's been done.
I don't think so. No? I didn't work out for McCarthy that well. And, you know, when you think about it, and also when you look at people like the Chip Roys, the Tom Masseys, the Andy Harrises, they drink their own bathwater. You know, they don't really drink Trump's bathwater.
That doesn't sound good.
No, it doesn't. But I think, you know, a lot of people call the Freedom Caucus the Trump Protection Caucus. But in reality, there are people there that are very idealistic, right? They're ideologues. And they're also going to do their own thing, and their districts are relatively safe. So as we get closer to the midterms, if things aren't tracking the way they want based on their ideology, based on what they're looking at as far as the deficit and the debt, you could see some issues. And I think there are going to be some arguments. I don't think it guarantees Mike Johnson the speakership at all. I think you're going to – I think, you know, if you look at Chip Roy, I think people forget Chip Roy certified the election. You know, and Chip, you know, was Freedom Caucus, and he went against most of the Freedom Caucus to do that. So I think, again, people need to realize, yes, Trump does control the party almost completely, but you do have people like the Chip Roys and the Thomas Masseys that are going to do what they're going to do.
Well, so if there's no guarantee that Mike Johnson is the speaker, then the Congress cannot begin, right? You have to have the speaker to swear in the Congress, then the lawmakers. There's also this thing coming down the pike called the inauguration.
That's happening, yeah.
There's also going to be a former president lying in state on January 9th. Can any of that happen if we don't have a speaker?
I think as far as with the former president, I think that absolutely does happen. But as far as, the multiple rounds of a speaker right at the beginning of the Congress, I think it would be interesting because how many Republicans are going to be sitting, 219 or 220? So say you have 3 or 4. They're like, we don't want to do this right now. We're going to demand some things.
Then you need Democrats.
There's not going to be one Democrat that votes for Mike Johnson for Speaker. Absolutely
That's what Hakeem
not.
Jeffries says.
Not one. Not one. Not one. It's not going to happen. And I think that at this point, when we see what's already happening, what they call the MAGA Civil War and things like that that's happening right now, it's going to be very interesting to see how that does.
You know what the first day of Congress is like. You've done this. They bring the kids. They're singing songs together, right? The big swearing, it's rah-rah. Everyone feels great. That's supposed to be the one day you feel good about your job in Washington. What's it going to be like this time?
It's going to be miserable. Miserable. When I swore in, it was that long 4 to 5 hour wait. Remember, it was coming over from the Republican to the Democratic Congress when I came in. It was a long, miserable day for me. It wasn't really ebullient. But I think it's going to be a miserable day. I think you're going to have a lot of votes, and I think
so. It's going to be many rounds either way.
I think it might be, but it depends on, again, if Comer can convince people. I hope he does a better job than convincing people in the Oversight Committee. But if he does a halfway decent job in convincing people, maybe it's easy. But I think they actually have to ramp up their lobbying efforts pretty hard to get everybody on board.
Just to elect a speaker, not even pass a piece of legislation.
Just to elect a speaker. Legislation's going to be a show. I mean, it's
well, you can't say that. No, it's okay. Let me ask you about something else coming January 6th. This is of personal import to you because you were an advisor on the January 6th committee. You also lived through that madness. I just wonder what you make of the fact that no one's talking about it.
It is, it's something,
4 years later, you would think this would be a big deal.
This should be the biggest deal, is what happened on January 6th. I honestly don't foresee Harris supporters storming the Capitol, coming in for January 6th. But this should be a huge deal. And I think part of it, I wonder a little bit, and I'm not trying to be self-deprecating or humble brag or anything, if I haven't done enough based on the data that we saw. And we still knew that, years, 2 to 3 years after, we really thought we'd see more in action when it came to actually criminal, I would say, charges against certain individuals. We had phone records, we had text records. Those are at the archives or wherever they're nested right now. But I have to tell you, to me, it's the most important thing. It's the way that I voted was because of January 6th. It's what I've seen. It's why I wrote my book. It's why I started my new company. Everything had to do with what I saw was the lack of resourcing, lack of technology, the fact we couldn't get what we needed to get. But the other good side of that was we had enough to identify some of the real bad actors at the command and control level. But I have to tell you, I think people want to forget. And I think it should be something we remember every January 6th. But again, it's a little surprising to me because for me, it's one of the most important things to happen in American history.
People want to forget. Isn't that interesting? Whether you are fond of what happened that day or not, I mean, do Democrats want to forget that because it's a difficult memory?
I think it was hard for them to run on it. I don't think they could actually verbalize specifically why January 6th was so important, which shocked me. Because for me, I can verbalize it pretty easily. As you know, we've talked about it before. Sure. But I wonder if America is on the psychiatric couch, right? And they're like, do you remember? They're like, January 6th, 2021, what happened that day? But it is really incredible to me. I think we need to actually bring that more to the forefront. And I think we need to revisit why that happened, the disinformation. Right, and the fact that 1 in 5 Americans don't read below the 6th grade level, I believe that's correct, and we have to look at education and things that happen. But why did people sack the Capitol based on fantasy?
It's not going to happen again this time around.
Not that I see.
Legislation would also prevent this from being a matter the Vice President needs to worry about.
That's right. Correct.
So, what happens when all of the January 6th offenders are pardoned? Is that something Donald Trump does?
I think
in the outset?
I think they'll say they'll go case by case, but I think they're going to pardon, I would say, a majority of the January 6th, those who are convicted. I wonder about those who actually beat law enforcement. It's going to be very difficult, I think, when you do these type of pardons. How do you actually explain away those that you pardon that actually, physically assaulted Capitol Police? I know them. Many that were there, and I do wonder how that's going to pan out.
It's been suggested that he leaves the biggest offenders right where they are.
He
that this wouldn't be
should.
a blanket pardon. Do you believe they go case by case through this matter? We're talking about a lot of people here, Denver.
I think they're going to set a minimum threshold, and they're not going to go case by case on that threshold.
Okay.
If it was people who just trespassed, I think they'll just pardon them.
Done.
Yeah, carte blanche. And for those who did the more serious things, it does bother me if they do get out. And I'm not for any pardons on the J6 individuals, but it's very difficult because it seems every president pardons people that I never would.
There's been talk of preemptive pardons here from Joe Biden. I always hear the name Liz Cheney, then you hear Adam Kinzinger.
Yeah.
How about Denver Riggleman?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly had some threats, and there's a possibility I'm subpoenaed, right? As we saw Barry Loudermilk's 128-page report, which I actually read. I know it's crazy. I read it, but it's ludicrous, right? And Barry had, I know Barry. They have I guess they made some points on the defense of the Capitol and some of those breakdowns. They were correct. But going after Liz Cheney, saying somehow she was meddling that way is just ludicrous. It's absolutely what Donald Trump wanted the committee to do. But I think as far as a preemptive pardon, I don't want one.
You don't?
I don't. I'd rather fight.
Why?
Because I think people need to stand up and, if you want, and I know there's some people who I would say, with Liz and even with Adam, maybe a preemptive pardon works in their favor. It's up to them to have that. But for me, I'd rather the bar fight right now.
The bar fight?
Yeah, I'd rather that. I mean, it's how I was raised. I didn't have a political career.
You do run a distillery.
I do run a distillery. We do make whiskey, and I do have an AI company, too. And so I also pretty good with data. So if they want somebody who makes whiskey and goes after bad people with data up in Congress, who's a former congressman, I'm happy to oblige.
You're going to get lunch with Elon to talk about this?
Oh, you know what? I would have lunch with Elon. I would tell him to stop posting, gobshite, right? And, and I think a lot of that has to do with, the things that he's doing. But yeah, I'd have lunch with Elon and tell him what I thought.
What's going on with Elon Musk here? We're already seeing a little bit of a breakdown over the H-1B situation.
Yeah.
The MAGA versus Musk situation seems tenuous. Will a year or two from now, will he still have the president's ear?
No.
No.
No. I mean, the thing about H-1B is what's interesting, he's going against some really big PACs on the far right, like Numbers USA and things like that. But for me, I'm an H-1B, H-2A, and H-2B supporter based on our district's very rural. But we also have a lot of technology in Virginia and the Commonwealth. And, I mean, that's why I'm starting an exploratory committee to run for statewide office is because of those type of issues. So, those are the type of things, that excite me.
Well, hold on. Because I always reserve the last minute or two of our conversations to ask you that last thing that, you may or may not want to answer.
Right.
Because whether you get a pardon or not, will you have a political future?
I didn't have one before when I won accidentally. So, but I think...
Would you like to have a political future?
I think I would rather try to change the dynamic of the two-party system that seems to, I would... ran as a Republican. I got to be behind the door with Trump. I was Republicans for Harris. And the things that I saw, on either side, which a lot of people say actually frightened me based on special interest. It always has when I got into politics, not to the age of about 46, 47. So, yeah, I have a lot of issues because I have individuals. I say a lot of issues. There's probably going to be the soundbite people play. But, I have a lot of responsibilities, right, fiduciary responsibilities for my companies. But that's why we started an exploratory committee, because I think there needs to be somebody who's willing to drag the axe and tell the truth, regardless if there's an R or D behind people's names. And that's why we're looking at, there's a lot of people, who've asked me. They don't have to force me. Nobody's going to force me to do anything. Yeah. But it was interesting to see the amount of support I had just for an exploratory committee.
Lieutenant governor.
Well, maybe that, or who knows, statewide office.
Would you run the state of Virginia?
I don't know if I could that's why we're looking at conflicts of interest and stuff like that. But lieutenant governor is absolutely a possibility.
There you have it from Denver Riggleman. Fascinating. You would not be running as a Republican, though, right?
No. Or a Democrat.
Rich party or a Democrat.
No, I'd be running as Denver Riggleman.
The gentleman from Virginia. It's always great to see you here at the table. Happy New Year. Thanks for coming over.
Happy New Year. Thanks.
I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Balance of Power, the fastest show in politics, where we just made some news. Denver Riggleman aiming for statewide office in Virginia, as we just learned here. Possibly. He's laughing. We'll have more on this ahead, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining us. The Monday edition as we consider The pardon power, something we were just talking about with former Congressman Denver Riggleman. It's something that Joe Biden is intimately familiar with now in the final throes of his presidency. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall joins us with more on what could follow. And Tyler, what's already been done? He's in rarefied air, this president.
Right, exactly, Joe. So acts of clemency are one of the few things that President Biden can still do to exert his executive action, since at this point it appears increasingly unlikely that Congress would work with him to advance any other parts of his agenda. And President Biden's doing just that. Actually, at this point in his first term, President Biden has issued more federal commutations than any other modern day president at that point in time. That's largely thanks to 1,500 federal commutations that President Biden announced earlier this month, along with 39 federal pardons for federal inmates who had been convicted of nonviolent crimes. He then, Joe, took it a step further last week, issuing 37 commutations for federal inmates on death row. The White House says that those inmates will remain in prison for life without the option of parole. But it was interesting because somebody that actually urged him to take that step was Pope Francis. And we've since learned that President Biden will actually travel to the Vatican next month in what will likely be his last international trip as president.
Wow, fascinating.
But as we talk about all these pardons, just quickly, it is important to note perhaps his most controversial and sweeping pardon, which I know you've spent a lot of time covering, which was for his son Hunter Biden, who averted prison time after being convicted on felony federal tax and gun charges, and is also protected from any further federal prosecution for any crimes he may or may not have committed over the past decade. A recent poll, Joe, shows us that many Americans disagreed with that decision. Only 2 out of 10 approved of it, according to a recent poll by the Associated Press.
Well, yeah, this is fascinating. That was the first pardon, of course, was the Hunter pardon. We've already indicated there could be more to follow. So stay right where you are, Tyler. I want to talk with you a little bit more about that. It recalls the conversation we had with the person who wrote the book on presidential pardons, Baltimore University law professor Kim Whaley. Here's what she said following those pardons from Joe Biden.
It's not unique, however, in that there have been presidents in the past that have issued general pardons without anything specific. For example, Jimmy Carter issued pardons for people who dodged the draft. The pardon is actually quite vague. It doesn't identify any people in particular. And something more tailored to an individual would be, of course, Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon, which was not just for the crimes that were ready to go in an indictment against Nixon that wasn't actually filed against him, but it was ready to go, but any additional crimes that he could have been charged with within that particular time period around Watergate. I believe the Biden pardon, the Hunter Biden, what you're identifying as unusual, was likely in anticipation of the incoming president, Donald Trump's promise to use the Department of Justice as an arm of retribution and to go after folks that he believes just should be prosecuted for having taken action that's inconsistent with Donald Trump's interests. Now, that's not Hunter Biden, but Hunter Biden, by virtue of being Hunter Biden, has definitely been had a target on his back politically in ways that other folks that engaged in the kind of behavior that gave rise to his plea deal as well as his conviction for lying on a gun application in Delaware for about his drug addiction, and then in California some tax problems that he later paid back with interest. These are not big, high-level crimes of violence, but I think the concern across the board is what's the Justice Department going to look like under a second Trump administration?
Yeah. Well, just the idea of these preemptive pardons, if we can call them that, has been getting a lot of talk around Washington. Some folks are raising their hands. Benny Thompson was asked about it, the former chair of the January 6th committee in the House, concerned about being targeted. We've heard Liz Cheney's name bandied about, Adam Kinzinger. What would that mean for the precedent in this administration if Joe Biden went there?
So those people actually, to the extent to which they were taking actions in connection with the speech and debate clause, there's arguably some immunity they already would have. I think the bigger concern really is the lower level folks that maybe participated as witnesses. You know, these documents, some of it is probably not even public, that Donald Trump would then have access to, that kind of retribution. But absolutely, this would be a precedent-setting action, but my view is that it would be in response to a precedent-setting plan for the Department of Justice. Arguably under Hoover, there was J. Edgar Hoover, there was the Justice Department used to spy on political enemies, famously Martin Luther King, for example. That was, not a proud part of American history. What Donald Trump and what looks like his cabinet picks seem to promise is widespread, potentially vindictive prosecutions. And for that, this would be setting a brand new precedent with a lot of problematic implications across the board.
Well, so as we consider what future preemptive pardons might be given to, say, members of the January 6th committee, there's also the question of pardons for people who have been convicted of crimes on January 6th. Just today, in an interview published with Time, the president-elect, who, of course, is Time's Person of the Year, was asked if he would pardon all January 6 defendants. He said yes. When asked, "You're going to do all of them?" He said, "I'm going to do case by case. And if they were nonviolent, I think they've been greatly punished." And the answer is, I will be doing that. I'm going to look to see if there were some that were really out of control. Keeping in mind here, Kim, that there are already hundreds of people who have been convicted or pleaded guilty to crimes related to their activities on January 6th, with the majority of those receiving some time behind bars. But given there have been different crimes and different sentences here, can he just do this in a blanket way, or will it have to be case by case, single names?
He could do it in a blanket way, or it could be case by case. The pardon power in the Constitution is extremely broad. There's very few cases that have made it to the Supreme Court to narrow it or put any limitations on it. And of course, in the Trump versus U.S. immunity case, where the court created criminal immunity for presidents, it went out of its way to get out a black Sharpie and underscore that the pardon power is extremely broad as far as the president's authority. To answer your question on January 6th, that would be about lawyers crafting the language of a more generic pardon to be sure that it captures the folks that Donald Trump would want to be included in that. I think there are over 1,800 prosecutions at this point. If he's talking about violent offenses, that kind of language, sort of accepting maybe people from the pardon if they engaged in violence, maybe that would be in there. Or he could give a list. I think it's on the Justice Department's website, fairly straightforward and easy. But that kind of pardon, I think, is of a concern in a way that, say, the Hunter Biden pardon was not, because of the nature of January 6th and the violence that was part of that. We have to ask ourselves with pardons, going back to George Washington, is a pardon being issued going to make the country less safe, either because that person will go on to commit crimes or because the pardon is being done in a self-interested way, in a corrupt way, in a way to allow the president to commit crimes. Those are different categories, I think, of pardons than pardons under the traditional way for mercy that go back before the King of England, back to the Bible. Jesus Christ was denied a pardon, and that gave birth to the Christian religion. The whole idea is the criminal justice system, people fall through the cracks, and there needs to be a fix. A survey done this summer, both Republicans and Democrats, a majority of both did not want to see pardons for the January 6th people that participated in that because of the concern of violence around elections and an emboldening of the energy around what happened on that day.
Kim Whaley talking with us on Bloomberg TV and radio as we return to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. Tyler, really interesting when this idea of preemptive pardons, unclear what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, but what are we hearing from the White House on this?
Right. Well, since that interview, we do know that White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre did come out and say that President Biden is looking into this, but that she didn't want to get ahead of the president and his own legal team. Now, when it comes to President-elect Trump, who really would be sort of the impetus for this happening, he's given us sort of mixed signals when it comes to this, but his most recent one was in a Truth Social post on Christmas, where he said what he referred to as the radical left's best chance is to get pardons before he takes office. So sort of mixed signals there on what that actually might mean in practice, right? Of course, Trump has said that, in his opinion, the best retribution is that he ultimately won office and that he's not going to urge his top prosecutors to go after people. We'll be watching, of course, Attorney Attorney General-elect Pam Bondi's confirmation hearing for any signs of that.
We'll have a lot more to follow on this for sure. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. Tyler, thank you so much always for the great reporting. We're going to have a lot more in hour 2 of Balance of Power. Stay with us. Congressman Chuck Fleischmann, the Republican from Tennessee, will be part of our conversation ahead. This is Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Donald Trump delivers the gift that Mike Johnson was hoping for, a complete and total endorsement of his bid to be Speaker of the House in the new Congress, which begins on Friday. We'll have the latest coming up with insights from Republican Congressman Chuck Fleischmann of Tennessee, from Republican strategist Ashley Davis, and from our political panel, Jeanne, Zaino, and Maura Gillespie are with us today. But we want to start with what we know on this matter. It happened a short time ago today. Donald Trump taking to Truth Social to make it clear he does, in fact, want Mike Johnson to be the next Speaker of the House. Bloomberg's Stephanie Lai is with us at the table with more on this. Stephanie, it's great to see you. This was a question until as recently as this morning when Jim Comer was trying to whip votes, actually calling skeptical Republicans in the House to get on Mike Johnson's side. Is this done, or is it more complicated than that?
You know, based off of the spending fight that we saw just a couple weeks ago, I don't think it's a done deal. There's still a lot of members of Congress who are perhaps a little stubborn on this matter. It's very clear that members aren't just going to bend to the whim of Donald Trump, and just given past precedent, I'm sure they're not going to this time around as well. We've already seen a couple of members say that they're looking for demands or concessions. You know, they're really looking for some sort of affirmation from Speaker Johnson that this next Congress will be functioning, that they'll get what they want, that conservative values will be upheld under his tenure.
Hakeem Jeffries has made clear there will not be a single Democratic vote to help Mike Johnson. So this is all on the Republican conference, and he's starting with, what, a 4 or 5 seat margin to play with here. The Freedom Caucus could, in its all on its own, sink his bid to be Speaker. But would anyone else want the job?
That's a really great question. You know, there are a couple people waiting in the wings. Mike Johnson wasn't really a name that we knew of the last time we had this the speaker fight. Someone just kind of came out of nowhere. And, you know, I think there is sort of an argument to be made for Republican members of Congress to want to have someone to take control who isn't looking for a position of power, who's really just looking out for their best interest. And so there could be a couple names that come out of nowhere and out of the left field, but it's too soon to tell.
Well, I don't know what was in the nachos at the Army-Navy football game. Remember, they got together in the suite there. They were going to hammer out the agenda for the new Congress. Do we have any reason to believe that they did, that it'll be border first and tax cuts? So a lot of this obviously will ride on what Mike Johnson decides to do here.
Certainly. You know, from my discussions with some insiders and people on the Hill, it seems like there is still discussion about whether or not we want 2 reconciliation bills. You know, how exactly are we going to see this through? Are we going to start with the border and then push tax reform to a later point in the year? And the argument for that is that tax issues and tax policy is just so much more complicated. There's a lot more players who are going to get involved.
So give them time to write the bill?
A lot of nuances that they have to consider,
It's pretty basic when you look at it that way, although getting it all done in one big bite would be, I guess, Trumpy, and it's something that I think, you know, some folks in Mar-a-Lago are suggesting that they want to see. You, of course, are covering this transition day in and day out. Donald Trump's a Jimmy Carter fan now?
You know, his Truth Social did make clear that he doesn't agree with him on every single philosophical and political matter.
Right. We knew that.
But he did send his condolences from him and Melania.
Yeah. Well, I strongly disagreed with him philosophically and politically. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, we'll show you the post here. I also realized he truly loved and respected our country and all it stands for. He worked hard to make America a better place. For that, I gave him my highest respect. It's kind of written like somebody who's had the job, too. Right? And actually understands what it means to be president.
Right. And we also saw a similar message come from Vice President-elect Senator Vance earlier today as well, just sort of giving that same message of, you know, he was looking out for the country. He has his respect.
Yeah. It's great to see you, Stephanie Lai. Happy New Year in advance.
New Year.
You've got a year ahead of you, I'll tell you that. Bloomberg's Stephanie Lai covering politics, the emerging administration, and will be ensconced once Donald Trump is in the White House. Thanks for being with us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power as we add the voice of Ashley Davis, the Republican strategist. Of course, you've heard from many times on this program with a slightly different take on things today as we consider the legacy of a Democratic president. She's of course, founding partner, Westfront Strategies. Great to see you, Ashley. I hope you're having a great holiday season. And we'll get to Jimmy Carter. I just wonder your thoughts on what's going on in the House here. Did Mike Johnson just close the deal? Is he a made man?
Well, first of all, Happy New Year, and I wish I was with you in person. I'm in cold weather right now, but I actually think it helps him a lot. Obviously, the president-elect understands that if he wants to get his agenda done or actually get anything done in the first 100 days of his administration, that we have to have a House in place right away. And Speaker Johnson is the one that would do the best job in regards to not having chaos of an election. And I mean, how many times did it take for McCarthy to get the first time 11 or 13? I forget the number right now. Yeah. But, you know, the only other name, as Stephanie was saying, names do pop up. The only other name that I think would kind of appease some of these conservatives on the right, which there aren't that many, but you don't need that many to upend his speakership, is Jim Jordan. Mm-hmm. And he has said several times that he is not going to run against Speaker Johnson. So I do think that President Trump coming out today was a huge win for them, but I also think it's self-serving because it's not going to help President Trump to have chaos going into his new administration.
Well, Mike Lawler agrees with you. The Republican from New York was on ABC this week, asked about this very matter, Ashley. Here's what he said.
Mike Johnson inherited a disaster when Matt Gaetz and several of my colleagues teamed up with 208 Democrats to remove Kevin McCarthy, which will go down as the single stupidest thing I've ever seen in politics. With that said, removing Mike Johnson would equally be as stupid.
That's quite a statement, I have to admit. Ashley, do you agree with it?
Yeah, I would probably not use as extreme words, but it wasn't smart, and it's not going to be smart again. I mean, and if you look at this is like Chip Roy. I'll be interesting to hear what Congressman Fleischmann says to you. You said he's coming up next because he's obviously considered a conservative member, but not a destructionist. So I'm assuming he thinks it's a good idea moving forward, Speaker Johnson stay in place.
Not a destructionist. Fascinating use of that word. Ashley, I want to ask you about the big debate that's broken out over immigration here. And I'm not referring to border security. I'm referring to actual legal immigration. People who watch this program know that you have a long history in the national security space and helped to bring about the Department of Homeland Security. And this idea of H-1B visas suddenly being extremely controversial as a component of this border issue is really interesting. Elon Musk, of course, suggesting that we lift the cap on these H-1Bs, bring in foreign-based talent to help us, particularly in high tech. But that runs counter to what a lot of the MAGA world thinks ought to be happening when it comes to the border and America first. How do you square this from where you're sitting?
Yeah, I think that this is totally getting combined into one conversation that really shouldn't be, because the visas that Elon and Vivek are speaking about, the HB1, they're actually legal visas that are sponsored by companies and corporations to bring talent in. And the MAGA side of the party and many others, not just MAGA, that are concerned about border security, in my mind, are people that are coming over here illegally. So I really think it's important to split the topic up, because one does not have anything to do with the other one. You have 65,000 available HB1 visas every year to apply to, and you get a 3-year that visa lasts 3 years, and you have actually one more chance to extend it another 3 years. But otherwise, it's not that people are coming across the border illegally, staying here, and not being able to be found. And then obviously the ones that commit crimes that are here as well. So it's a different program. So I do agree with Elon and Vivek on this, and I guess the president.
Duly noted. But now that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy have kicked the nest on this. We have an active debate going on over work visas, whether they're skilled or not. And Donald Trump was talking about dreamers in the only interview he's done since being elected as something that he would work with Democrats on. So it sounds to me, Ashley, like just shutting down the border is not enough. Is the answer not comprehensive immigration reform?
I think that comprehensive immigration reform, I mean, in 2007 was the closest that ever was becoming true to reality when Senator Kennedy and then President Bush almost did strike a deal. I think that a win for President Trump is in this first year right away, which is why I think reconciliation will happen. I think there's two buckets that will happen per your earlier conversation with Stephanie. I think they'll do border first along with energy. But the reason why is if you get the 1 million illegal immigrants that are in this country out of the country the first year that have committed a crime or have completely exhausted their appeal process. That's 1 million people that can go out right away, which is a huge win for Trump. So if he does that and then works slowly over the next 3 years trying to find and round up all these other people that have come over here illegally, I think that's going to be phase 2. But if you deal with HB1 visas or if you deal with dreamers, I mean, that's in my mind is stage 3, 4, 5. You've got to get rid of these top ones first and second that have committed crimes in this country.
Rick Davis's ears are burning after I said comprehensive immigration reform as we spent time with Ashley Davis. I haven't asked you about Jimmy Carter. Ashley, what do you make of the constant comparisons, by the way, not just today, but for the balance of Joe Biden's administration being compared to Jimmy Carter? Is that fair?
No, I think, listen, I said this before on my show. President Bush, my boss, used to always say, let history make its decision on what I've done. And I think that Jimmy Carter will go down in history as and even yesterday when he passed away, there's many people that believe in many things that he did. I think during the campaign when people were criticizing President Biden, they were giving him obviously an insult saying that President Carter never did anything to this country. What you said earlier and what Stephanie said in regards to President Trump giving his condolences, being part of this club is a very lonely club. And I think that there are many people country that do respect this. You see that the funeral will be on January 9th. Obviously, the stock market will be closed. Does that mean you get off on the 9th, Joe?
I don't think so. We're going to call you to join us, actually.
But I think that it was more of an insult to President Biden than it was, to go back to your question, than it actually was about Jimmy Carter. He'll go down in history of maybe making some mistakes, but also doing some good things.
You think that Trump's statement about Jimmy Carter was more of an insult to Joe Biden? Is that what you're suggesting?
During the campaign, when he was being compared to Jimmy Carter, the statement that he made yesterday, I thought was very appropriate.
Well, so what's the lesson here? And, I always save the easy question for last when we're out of time, Ashley. But I keep hearing from people, Democrats and Republicans, who say, you know what? The lasting impression is that he had dignity, that people trusted his word, that he was a nice guy. What am I supposed to take from that in this age in Washington?
Well, I mean, obviously there's lots of criticism, but I'm reading this book right now, actually, talking about all the various presidents that have gone down and saying there wasn't integrity or there wasn't, they weren't patriotic enough. I mean, how many people hated Ronald Reagan that now the entire Republican Party runs on being Ronald Reagan-esque? So I think, again, this to me goes back on time heals a lot of wounds and a lot of memories are short.
How true. Joining us live from the Matterhorn, Ashley Davis, founding partner, Westfront Strategies. It's great to see you, Ashley. Happy New Year, and we'll see you in 2025 because we're going to have a lot to talk about. Of course, that's going to start right after we come back from New Year's Day. We will get a break in the markets on Wednesday. We're back Thursday, and the new Congress begins on Friday. That's when the voting we're talking about for Mike Johnson and the swearing in of this Congress will take place, and we're going to have live coverage for you of what could be another rambunctious day in Washington. To the 6th, of course, to certify the vote. To the 9th, in which Jimmy Carter will lie in state here in Washington on the 20th, our inaugural. This is Bloomberg. Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Underway, live from Washington. Great to see you. Thanks for joining us here. I'm Joe Matthew in the nation's capital, where the words complete and total are resonating on Capitol Hill. They would be from Donald Trump, of course, the president-elect, on Truth Social this Monday before the new Congress begins, offering his complete and total endorsement to Mike Johnson to be the speaker in the new Congress, writing, quote, "The American people need immediate relief from all the destructive policies of the last administration." Let's assemble our political panel for their take on what's going to happen next, because it may not be as simple as we think. Jeanne Zaino is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic analyst, and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, alongside Republican strategist Maura Gillespie. Of course, principal and founder, Bluestack Strategist. Great to have you both with us today. And Jeanne, I wonder your thought on this, because as soon as we think we have things figured out, then you go through 15 rounds of voting. We know that the Chip Roys of the world, members of the Freedom Caucus and some other MAGA-aligned Republicans don't like Mike Johnson. They don't like the idea of the continuing resolution that we're operating under right now. I'm not sure who they want to be the next speaker, but only a couple of them could derail this whole plan. What's going to happen on Friday?
Well, you know, to your point, it only is going to take one more. We already know that Massey is not going to vote for Johnson on the floor. And I was struck by the president's Truth Social, because not only, 29 little words about Mike Johnson, but it came after over 200 words about this big support he got in the election and the mandate he has going into Washington, D.C. That mandate is not reflected in those numbers in Congress. And he has a real problem, as does Mike Johnson, as a result of that. Because, of course, let's not forget, there is no stick they can use against the members of the Freedom Caucus. You cannot primary them from the right. So what he has to offer them is a carrot. And the only carrot I can think of is Mike Johnson's head on a plate. And so for that reason, this is not a done deal. It's better. Sorry for that. It's better than if he didn't endorse, but by no means does this close the deal for Mike Johnson. I think he gets there, but I think it's going to be a little bit tough, because they know that they have all the power, and that's the problem with these numbers in the House.
Maura, I can only imagine what John Boehner is thinking right now as we have this conversation. The fact is, you know what it's like to work in a Republican speaker's office. And I wonder if you see Friday being the traditional rah-rah, bring the family photo op kind of day that you have for a new or a renewed majority in this case, however thin it may be, or if we're going to get bogged down into some heavy drama on the floor on Friday.
Well, my former boss would probably be pretty relieved that this is not his circus to deal with. I think that for those far-right MAGA members of Congress that are already out there saying they're not going to support Mike Johnson, and or making lists of demands in order to get that vote, to give him their vote for speaker, they should probably be concerned about maybe MAGA world turning on them. And I think that that's what the Trump world should be doing. If his message today says, let's get in line, let's get to work, let's not waste this opportunity, then he should be probably pretty upset with those members who are going to vote against Speaker Mike Johnson, because in theory they're voting against the Republican Party and this Republican-led government that they're going to have in a matter of days. So if I were the Trump team, I would start using their megaphones and targeting those members of Congress, saying that they're not willing to get to work. They don't have a plan. They just want to be obstructionists and point the finger. It would be a little hypocritical considering how many of those MAGA world people do that. But I think that that would be the most effective strategy, is to call them out and say that they're not actually looking to get things done. It's easier to complain than it is to lead. And they're refusing to do so by not supporting Speaker Johnson.
Mike Johnson writing on X, in this case, honored and humbled by Donald Trump's support. He says he would work with him to, quote, quickly deliver on your America First agenda. He was writing directly to Donald Trump, Jeanne. As some have suggested, Donald Trump is the real speaker. Will he be the one to decide the agenda? In the opening weeks of this Congress, we've been arguing about whether it should be border or whether it should be the Trump tax cuts. Donald Trump, of course, is going to start his second term with a series of executive actions on the border, Jeanne. So what should happen legislatively?
Yeah, Donald Trump is going to set this agenda. They have been hard at work on this. He has been working on this with his team for 4 years, so he knows exactly what he wants to do. They will start with the border, I believe, because the taxes will be much harder. And just to go back to the Truth Social post, just hours before the endorsement of Mike Johnson, he took to Truth Social, Donald Trump did, to criticize Mike Johnson for not lifting the debt ceiling. And to me, this was a shout out to the MAGA world and a sort of cry for help about his agenda as it pertains to taxes, as it pertains to the budget, because he knows how thorny this is going to be. And the numbers that we have coming into this House are clear. You have about 38 Republicans who will not vote to raise that debt ceiling without spending cuts. And that means a disaster for Donald Trump and Mike Johnson, because they can't get it over the finish line then without Democrats who will want something in return. So read that post. Donald Trump knows this is a pending disaster for him in his first 100 days. That is anger at Mike Johnson for not doing this. Of course, in Mike Johnson's defense, it was an impossible task at the last minute, but he has not forgotten that. And so he endorsed, yes, but I think to me, it's a lukewarm endorsement. What can you do for me? Because you didn't do what I said before.
All right, Maura, what do you think? It's a big love fest right now, but we get divorced right around the time we hit the debt ceiling.
Well, what's funny about the debt ceiling conversation is that that week leading up to it, Donald Trump talked to a reporter and said, you know, Democrats wanted to get rid of the debt ceiling. I'll champion that effort with them. Meanwhile, people in the far right and the MAGA world were complaining about Mike Johnson having worked with Democrats across the aisle to get the first bill done that was going to avoid a government shutdown drama-free. And that got derailed because he was working with Democrats. They were so angry, but yet you hear nothing about people in the Republican flank being upset with Donald Trump for saying that he was going to work and champion the effort of Democrats to eliminate the debt ceiling. So I think it's very interesting. And again, I think that we all could use a bit of objective viewpoints here and take a look at what's happening. Yeah. Mike Johnson certainly has his work cut out for him. But I do think that, you know, the Boehner rule, back when Obama versus Boehner during this conversation of the debt ceiling, it was 1-to-1. So if you're for every dollar spent or every dollar increase in the debt ceiling, a dollar needs to be cut from the budget. So maybe they'll start working towards that goal. But it was not an easy feat back then. I think it'll be even harder to do now.
The Boehner rule. Man, you're bringing us back. I want a cigarette, Maura. Jeanne, I don't know. Mike Lawler also warned Republicans against moving to topple Mike Johnson in that Sunday morning interview that we played a little bit of a moment ago. It just reminds us of the fact that not necessarily anyone would want that job if Mike Johnson were fired. You can talk about Jim Jordan, Steve Scalise all day long, but haven't we been through that?
We have. And, you know, I love the Lawler quote. It was stupid then. It's stupid now. And he's absolutely right on that. But try convincing the Chip Roys of the world. Try convincing the Tom Masseys. These are people who believe profoundly that that is why they are in Congress. And they don't have a threat. And so to Maura's earlier point, if Donald Trump and his base can somehow threaten these people in their district from the right, maybe that would get them to move. Otherwise, I don't see them moving. And the only path forward, which Mike Johnson knows, which is why he was working with Hakeem Jeffries before that first CR was blown up, is via the Democrats, given these numbers. And that is not going to go over well. So there is no really good option for Mike Johnson. And to your point, the best thing he's got going for him is so far, nobody has put their hand up to say, I want this job. But, you know, there is always people who are probably there. We don't know them who would take this job in a heartbeat. It is third in line or second in line, the way you count it, to the presidency. So it is an important job. And there will be people if Mike Johnson is pushed aside.
Wow. Well, I guess until then, smoke them if you got them. The vote is on Friday. We've got a lot to learn here. Great panel and great conversation. Jeanne, Zaino, Maura, Gillespie, thank you both so much for the insights today. We're going to play this to a member of Congress, a member of the Republican Conference, Chuck Fleischmann. The gentleman from Tennessee will join us next here on Balance of Power to talk out these very issues and what is about to happen in the new Congress. The 119th starts on Friday. We're live from Washington on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for being with us on the fastest show in politics, where we stop down, of course, every day to bring you up to date on Wall Street as well. And the markets are sliding into New Year's once again today. Not the best look for stocks, though crypto has turned higher. Bloomberg's Alex Semenova is with us from World Headquarters in New York for her take on things. How are we doing, Alex?
Hey, Joe, great to be on with you. So after a torrid run this year, stocks really losing their momentum into the final stretch of 2024. The S&P 500 down about 1.7% for the month of December. This is highly unusual for a seasonally bullish period for equities. Since 1950, the index has actually posted an average gain of 1.6% in December and risen 74% of the time. So clearly breaking with that trend here. And just taking a look at the averages today, the S&P is down about 0.5%, the third straight session lower, though I do want to point out that it is well off of session lows. It was down more than 1% earlier in the day, so perhaps some dip buyers now starting to step in. The NASDAQ 100 down about 0.7%, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average down about 130 points. And all three major averages earlier in the day were down more than 1%. The U.S. 10-year yield retreating down to 4.55%. You remember, Joe, last week it eclipsed 4.6%. And some of the names in focus today are Boeing, of course, that stock down after the deadly plane crash in South Korea that unfortunately killed 179 people, though analysts are coming out to defend the stock, saying this has nothing to do with the production of the aircraft, but was just perhaps a bird that got stuck in the engine. Investors still investigating that. And American Airlines actually slightly higher today, despite the losses in the broader market. They got an upgrade from Raymond James, which pointed to an improved revenue outlook.
I'll tell you, it's just a matter of time, it seems, Alex. People just can't resist, right? That's been the story of the market this year. Every time we were headed for a correction, the dip buyers moved in and moved this thing to new highs. And if you go back a year, there's been some interesting reporting on the terminal. Nobody seemed to call this, right? This was supposed to be a year of modest gains after a big jump the year earlier, and here we are talking about another 20% move.
Yeah, Joe, I don't envy anyone on Wall Street whose job it is to predict what the stock market will do, but especially not for the past 3 years where we've seen so many twists and turns with the economy and the market after the pandemic. And especially these past couple of years, investors were worried that higher interest rates by the Federal Reserve would tank the market, would spur a recession. But instead, we got 2 consecutive years of returns of more than 20%. Last year, of course, people were predicting losses. We got a 23% S&P 500 rally. And going into this year, no one thought that at lofty valuations that could happen again. And so investors kind of predicted a modest gain and instead, again, double-digit returns. And that saw big names like Goldman Sachs, UBS. They had to revise their forecasts for stocks about 4 times this year, a highly unusual frequency. And then we saw some of the biggest bears on Wall Street, of course, capitulate their outlooks. Mike Wilson, notably, he was a bear the past few years, and he has turned bullish on equities. JP Morgan also held on to its bearish call for the past 2 years, but now it can't resist this rally. So going into next year, now forecasters also predicting a gain, perhaps at a time where we're actually at a crossroads where valuations are so high and there's uncertainty around what will happen with yields and if this momentum can continue, Joe.
Yeah, big questions, too, around crypto, whether we'll see that Bitcoin National Reserve. I know there have been a lot of bets made already on that front, but it's something that we'll be following closely with your help. Alex, great to see you. Thank you so much for the coverage today from New York, as always. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we do have breaking news on the new Congress, or so we think we do. In any other world, this would be a deal closer, and it may well be in this case as the president-elect Donald Trump throws his complete, I believe, total and complete, as he termed it, endorsement behind Mike Johnson in his bid to be the Speaker of the House in the new Congress, something we want to discuss, among other issues, with the gentleman from Tennessee. Republican Congressman Chuck Fleischmann is with us right now live on Bloomberg TV and radio as he prepares to make tracks back to the nation's capital. Congressman, it's good to see you. I hope you had a great Christmas, and I hope you're on the threshold of a great New Year's. In the meantime, we have some business to talk about here. Is this a deal closer for Mike Johnson to carry the gavel in this new Congress?
I feel so good about President Trump's strong and unequivocal endorsement. I did the same thing this morning right before him. So I like that. I sent out a little tweet to Mike Johnson thanking him and saying, look, the great news is the president-elect, President Trump, and I are on the same page once again. The reality is we're going to have a one-seat majority after the three leave. It's going to be a tough Congress. Really, this should be Mike Johnson's. He's earned the job. He's earned our trust. He's got my full support. But candidly, getting Donald Trump's support is going to really, really help close this deal. It's a deal maker. Without that endorsement, I was a little bit concerned for Mike Johnson. Now I feel very good about January 3rd.
Well, that's interesting. I don't think you're suggesting it was your idea here for Donald Trump to make that post, though the timing is rather interesting, Congressman. You're not the only one, though. A lot of people were trying to get to Donald Trump. A lot of folks were trying to say good things about Mike Johnson within the conference, including Jim Comer. And you can finish your statement if you want here. But Comer said just as recently as yesterday, we have 5 Republicans that won't commit to voting for Mike Johnson. Does Donald Trump bring them over?
I think he is so persuasive, and if he doesn't bring them all, I think ultimately he'll bring most of them. You have to look at the situation and say, if not Mike Johnson, who or whom? And then that big blank is out there. Who can get to that magic number? And it's not going to be easy. So we don't want to go 15 rounds. I was very active in the 15-round fight to get McCarthy made Speaker. Actually helped him in that. In fact, I was one of the last people to go and speak with Matt Gaetz and plead with him. And it actually went well at that time. Didn't go so well later. But the reality is we need a strong, unified message because, candidly, the way it works, the Democrats are watching on the other side of the aisle. If they perceive weakness, they will take advantage of that. And we don't need that. In order for President Trump to have a strong agenda carried out, the House is going to have to be that first step. Getting Mike Johnson elected as Speaker, I think, will clearly get that done. Then, of course, in the Senate, I think sledding will be much easier with that 53-seat majority.
Well, let's talk about the agenda for a moment then. I know that Donald Trump and Mike Johnson were talking about it at the Army-Navy game. I don't know that anything has been hammered out for sure. Will Republicans try to get their arms around the border first? Trump tax cuts second? Or both at the same time?
I think you start now, of course, President Trump will choose his batting order, but I think it's smart to start with the easier tasks first. The border is easy because Joe Biden and this administration have done such a terrible job. It's porous, it's open. We've had millions and millions of illegals come in. We have got to fix it. And you've got the vast support of the vast majority of the American people. Big cities, rural areas, we have got to deal with this. It's a national security crisis. Getting that done. I think the second thing should be foreign policy. I think Trump is going to be very strong in bringing peace to Ukraine and Russia. I think he will have great credibility with both Putin and with Zelensky. So I think that could be another strong early win. The Middle East is another story. It's a very tumultuous region, but Trump can take his best shot at that. I think he'll do well there. Taxes is going to be something else. It's going to be difficult. It's cumbersome. Our tax code is cumbersome in and of itself. We need to preserve these Trump tax cuts that I actually voted for in his first term. I think it's critically important for our economy. But I think we will take these in progression. We will test the waters. We will work through the process and hopefully have a good, strong first 100 days for President Trump.
There's a question about how wide to go on the matter of immigration, Congressman. We've been dealing with the idea of border security in a vacuum until Elon Musk brought up the matter of H-1B visas. These are, of course, the work visas that bring skilled talent from other countries. I talked to your colleague, Haley Stevens, Democrat from Michigan, about this. Here's what she said.
I'd say that Elon Musk maybe knows a thing or two about it, given his immigration history and given his employment base and given, frankly, the role that his companies are playing, not just here in the United States of America, but across the world. And so we need access to that talent. I think that could be very interesting. It'd maybe be a smart move of the Republican governing majority if they could do something for high-skilled workers.
Is she right, Congressman, and should work visas be part of this debate?
I have worked for work visas back when I was the ranking member, highest Republican on Homeland Security appropriations. This is something, we've got a great talent pool that sometimes we are educating in this country and then forcing away. I think Elon Musk is right on this. More importantly, President Trump backed him up on this. We've got a great talent pool. Let's face it, we are a nation of immigrants. We want it to be done legally. We want it to be done correctly. But we sure don't want to educate a great talent pool and then send them back to China or to India or anywhere else in the world where they can glean the benefits of our great educational system. So it is a process. Interestingly enough, the pushback we originally got was not from Republicans, was from pro-labor Democrats who actually tanked a lot of what Ms. Stevens was talking about in those hearings. So we took it right up to the edge many times and tried to get it done. It was labor Democrats who scuttled it. It was not Republicans.
Right up to the edge. Isn't that the truth? Congressman, we're spending a lot of time this week on Bloomberg talking about winners and losers from the year on Wall Street. And among the biggest gainers we saw are companies you know a little bit about. Constellation, Vistra, nuclear power providers that are suddenly in high demand because of data centers, because of the need for clean, renewable energy to run data centers that are apparently going to help pioneer the way forward when it comes to AI. This is something I know is close to your heart and you've worked closely on when it comes to utilities and nuclear power specifically. What will this new Congress do to make good on these bets that Wall Street is making, that growth is coming?
Yes, I'm excited. So our listeners know what I do. I'm the chairman of the Energy and Water Subcommittee of Appropriations. That funds the Department of Energy, funds all of the nuclear power and new nuclear technologies. This is what I do in Congress. I've had the privilege of speaking with Elon Musk about this. I've spoken with other folks. I've had one-on-one conversations with President Trump in his first administration, actually even on Air Force One, about this and wrote a paper for him. Chris Wright, the new incoming Secretary of Energy, very bright, very capable, very solicitous of nuclear. He has previously sat on the board of some nuclear companies. So I am bullish on new nuclear. But what does that mean? That means, Joe, we have got to get it right. There's a lot of designs out there. There are a lot of dollars out there. If you look at the fiscal 2025 bill that I wrote, I structured it on appropriations to basically continue to fund new nuclear. About $9 billion, $8.9 billion specifically for that. We've got to make a delineation, though. We need big new nuclear, like the Vogtle plant. We need to build big plants. We need to build smaller plants. And we're looking at microreactors. The bottom line is American technology in this area is superior. Our adversaries are moving ahead in this, meaning Russia and China, but our friends are as well. The French, the South Koreans, they are moving into this sector and doing a good job. The bottom line is, I think we need public-private partnerships. We need to invest in that. I do think the markets will respond to that. We have just got to make sure we pick the right technologies. If we pick the wrong ones, we will lose.
Well, that's a good answer, Congressman. I've got less than a minute. Is Donald Trump on board with nuclear?
I think so. Donald Trump is great. He's on all of the above. What I'm going to do is create an eighth energy caucus. I've got several in Congress. I'm going to call this the American Dominance in Energy Caucus. It's designed to parallel Donald Trump's Energy Council that Governor Burgum is going to chair. The reason we want to do that is make sure that all of the above means all of the above. Let's face it, I love oil. I love natural gas.
Come back and talk to us more about it.
I love solar.
This is going to be a big story in the new year, Congressman, and it's good to be in touch with you. Thank you for the time today, and thanks for sharing the insights with us ahead of the new Congress. It starts on Friday. Chuck Fleischmann, the Republican from Tennessee. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Much more ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I would hope that the nations of the world might say that we had built a lasting peace based not on weapons of war, but on international policies which reflect our own most precious values. These are not just my goals, and they will not be my accomplishments, but the affirmation of our nation's continuing moral strength and our belief in an undiminished, ever-expanding American dream.
January 20th, 1977. President Jimmy Carter having just been sworn into office there on the scaffolding on the west side of the Capitol. That scaffolding is back in place now for the inauguration of Donald Trump, of course, just a couple of weeks away. President Biden has announced that Thursday, the 9th of January, will be a national day of mourning. As we've been telling you on Bloomberg, that will include a market closure. Markets will be closed on January 9th with the pomp and circumstance that you would expect surrounding the funeral of a president of the United States in the offing. Plans are already underway right now at the White House for all of this, and we want to bring you to the White House for an update now from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. Tyler, what do we know?
Yeah, hey, Joe. As you mentioned, President Biden has ordered an official state funeral for former President Jimmy Carter to take place here in Washington. That will happen on Thursday, January 9th. In a statement last night, President Biden called Carter a, quote, dear friend, adding that he was a man of, quote, great character and courage. Biden was actually one of the first senators to endorse then-candidate Carter's bid for the White House in 1976. He actually retold that moment during remarks last night from St. Croix, where he's vacationing with his family.
When I endorsed him for president, I told him why I was endorsing him, and that it was not only his policies, but his character, his decency, the honor he communicates to everyone.
In a post on Truth Social, President-elect Trump said the challenges Carter faced as president came at a, quote, pivotal time for our country, and he did everything in his power to improve the lives of all Americans. For that, we all owe him a debt of gratitude. Of course, Joe, there were many tribulations during the Carter presidency, from foreign to domestic policy, including economic turmoil marked by a stagnant economy and high inflation. Now, other world leaders have also weighed in. That includes UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, even the Pope, all sending their condolences in statements last night as the news crossed. Now, the Carter Center has said that there will be two public observances, one in Atlanta, of course, the other here in Washington. And as we do await more details of those events, one thing that we are expecting, Joe, is that the flags will fly at half-mast during President-elect Trump's inauguration at the U.S. Capitol on January 20th.
We've had national days of mourning in our recent memory. Of course, Tyler, the deaths of former presidents George H.W. Bush, that was 2018. Jerry Ford, that was 2006. And then, of course, in 2004, I'll never forget the procession in the funeral of Ronald Reagan here in the nation's capital. What will Washington look like this time?
Right. Well, a headline just crossing the terminal in the last hour. President Biden has declared that federal agencies will be closed that day. The federal government shutting down. You mentioned, of course, the stock markets also will not be open on that day. We are expecting there to be a funeral procession. First, though, Jimmy Carter will lie in state in Atlanta, in the Georgia state capitol, over the weekend. His body will then be transported to Washington on Monday, where he then will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol. I've learned that only 12 other presidents have had that honor of lying in state at the U.S. Capitol before his funeral procession to the National Cathedral. We are also expecting, Joe, that President Biden will deliver a eulogy. We are still awaiting word on whether or not President-elect Trump will attend that ceremony.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, live from the North Lawn of the White House. Tyler, thank you so much. Just out of frame where Tyler is standing is the other part of the scaffolding that's been erected for the inauguration. That's where President-elect Trump will review the parade once he gets to the White House that day. Of course, the reflections that we all have, the memories that we have from Ronald Reagan's funeral procession here in Washington, quite pronounced, with black bunting on federal buildings, the caisson carrying the former president's casket, and the riderless horse, one of the great elements of tradition that will likely be part of this procession, something that we'll keep you posted on as these plans come together. Of course, Jimmy Carter died yesterday at 100 years old, and we remember the life and the legacy of Jimmy Carter here on Bloomberg.
President Carter came to office in the wake of Watergate and Vietnam with a commitment to right the ship of state.
President Carter brought back to government honesty, integrity, and faith in government. He ran as a candidate on a government as good as his people, and he truly did deliver that.
I think President Carter in many ways was ahead of his time in terms of his emphasis, for example, on human rights, in terms of his thinking about alternative energy, in terms of his role in the Middle East peace agreements that he put together. And we all know that his ex-presidency, which has been such a long one, has been graced by remarkable contributions to humanity by former President Carter. I think right now, he is seen very favorably. I'm really happy to see that because he's a very special man.
One of President Carter's biggest challenges was energy in the face of the second Arab oil embargo.
Well, he was president during a very challenging time. As you recall, there was the oil embargo, which drove oil prices up dramatically. That became a catalyst for the highest inflation that we had really since the war, and probably even before that. And so he had to take some very tough fiscal measures. He did appoint Paul Volcker, who, by very much tightening monetary policy, caused a recession, which certainly was not an easy thing for President Carter to run through.
He was the first person to talk about energy and how we had to start looking at renewable energy plans and how our country could invest and incentivize in that area. And I don't know if you remember, but he had a solar panel on the White House, which when he left, President Reagan took down. But he had fuel mileage standards and, really realized, I think, way before anybody else that we had to start thinking about what climate and what it was doing to our planet.
But as influential as Jimmy Carter was as president, he will be remembered every bit as much for what he did after he left office.
The thing, though, that I think is absolutely most notable about President Carter is we can all debate the relative merits of any individual president's term, but I think it's inarguable that President Carter is the single most impressive, most successful, and most to be admired ex-president in the history of our nation. This is a man who took the responsibilities of being a visible public figure incredibly seriously and was a role model to all of us.
And a proclamation from the White House announcing the death of James Earl Carter, Jr. writes in part, President Carter was a man of character, courage, and compassion whose lifetime of service defined him as one of the most influential statesmen in our history. Joe Biden goes on to write, he worked to eradicate disease, forge peace, advance civil rights and human rights, promote free and fair elections, house the homeless, and always advocate for the least among us, unquote. As mentioned over the course of this program, we heard from Donald Trump as well. The challenges Jimmy faced, he writes, as president came at a pivotal time for our country. And he did everything in his power to improve the lives of all Americans. For that, the president-elect writes, we all owe him a debt of gratitude. That, of course, from a Donald Trump who was very critical of Jimmy Carter and Joe Biden over the course of the campaign. Things will, of course, feel a bit different once the tributes and the processions begin here in Washington. Reminding you, January 9th, the National Day of Mourning, we'll have special coverage that day. The markets will be closed, and we'll have much more here from Washington, D.C. I'm Joe Matthew in the nation's capital. Thanks for being with us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.